In the quiet corners of Asia, where mountains breathe mist and forests whisper names long forgotten, there are rituals still performed, not for the living, but to keep the dead at peace. Welcome to a place where silence is not empty, but echoing, where every forgotten tradition holds a price, and where some brides do not marry men, but spirits. This is Whispers of Asia. Tonight, we journey to the remote highlands of northern Myanmar, a place where sacred smoke swirls through bamboo huts and ancestral spirits watch with hollow eyes. They say a bride once entered the smoke room, but never left. And since that night, the village has not dared to speak her name. But some names whisper themselves back into the world. This is The Bride in the Smoke Room, a tale of sacred rituals, spiritual abduction, and what happens when the dead do not bless the living, but take them. The village of Hang Son lay deep in the northern mountains of Myanmar, nestled between ridges where clouds clung low and the wind carried the smell of bamboo, fire, and memory. Time moved differently here. The sun took its time rising, the river hummed its ancient songs, and the dead were never truly gone. They listened, they watched, and sometimes they chose. The villagers believed the spirits lived among them, not in the form of ghosts, but as wind in the leaves, ash in the fire, and shadows that moved when no one else did. They were ancestors, guardians, gods, and sometimes thieves. It was in this village, on the eve of a long-awaited wedding, that the air grew heavier than usual. Smoke drifted early from the ceremonial hut at the forest's edge, not cooking smoke, not hearth fire, but ritual smoke. Thick, sweet, clinging to the lungs like breath that refused to leave. Inside her family's stilted bamboo home, Ah Tandar sat motionless, her spine straight, hands in her lap, face veiled in soft white lace. Her wedding dress was hand-woven from ceremonial thread, golden silk dyed with turmeric and crushed betel leaves, blessed by the elders, stitched by silent women over many moons. It smelled of incense and fear. Outside, villagers gathered. Children were not allowed to speak. Drums remained silent. This was not a celebration. This was Kiar Sin, the smoke blessing, a ritual older than the village, older than even the oral histories passed from tongue to tongue. For one night, the bride was to be sealed inside a bamboo hut. No light, no food, no human voice, only sacred smoke, made from herbs grown in the graveyards of ancestors, burned in a fire pit carved with tooth marks, from animals that had died without injury, their souls said to be untethered and pure. The smoke would rise, coil around her body, and invite the spirits to bless her womb, her future, her soul. At dawn, she would emerge, reborn, anointed, ready. Unless she wasn't. "Do not fear," said Ko-Min Thane, the groom, as he knelt beside her one last time before the rite began. His voice shook. "You'll only be alone for a night." Ah Tandar did not reply. Her eyes, once warm as brewed tea, now stared past him, fixed on a point behind his shoulder. There was no smile beneath her veil, no farewell, only stillness, a stillness that unnerved him. She had agreed to this, she had prepared, she had honored her role, and yet something was wrong. "She's not cold," whispered an old woman nearby. "She's remembering." Remembering what, he wondered, but he dared not ask. 2 monks arrived, silent, barefoot. They did not bow to her. Instead, they tied red thread around her wrists and whispered to the smoke pots that were already burning at the base of the ritual hut. The scent was overpowering, bitter lemongrass, dry turmeric, and something else, something rotten sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. The shaman of the village, a woman named Amayi, stepped forward. Her face was painted white with rice ash, her lips streaked with black ink. She spoke no words, only marked Tandar's forehead with 3 lines of soot. This meant acceptance. It meant no turning back. The hut was small, just wide enough for a woman to sit cross-legged, surrounded by jars of smoldering herbs. Its roof was layered banana leaves. Its floor was old cloth and packed soil. There were no windows, only a hole in the ceiling to let the smoke spiral toward the sky. Tandar stepped inside without a word. The door, woven from bamboo strips, was shut behind her and tied closed with red silk cords soaked in salt and grave ash to keep the living in and the dead from leaving. The ceremony was complete. No prayers, no dancing, no music, only the smoke. Night fell like a curtain, thick and absolute. Crickets cried in the distance, then fell silent. Not a single bird called, not a single dog barked. Ko Min Thane sat near the ritual fire all night, his hands clenched tight, watching the hut, watching the faint coils of smoke rise through the slated roof, dancing upward like dying breath. He thought of how they had met, not through love, but arrangement. Still, something in her had softened him. She was kind, steady, eyes full of quiet questions, a woman who would be loyal. But in the weeks before the wedding, she had grown quiet. She had begun to stare into corners. She had burned her hands once and said she hadn't felt it. She had said strange things in her sleep, words he did not understand, in a voice that didn't sound like hers. He thought it was nerves. He thought wrong. At dawn, the shaman returned with the monks. Ko Min Thane stood immediately, heart pounding. The red silk was still tied, untouched. The bamboo door still sealed. The smoke no longer rose. Silence hung like damp cloth. The shaman untied the cord and opened the door. Inside, the hut was filled with cold ash, settled into soft piles like melted snow. The ceremonial jars had all gone out, the cloth beneath them scorched. But Tandar was gone. No footprints in the ash inside the hut, no tear in the bamboo wall, no broken thread, no sign of struggle, nothing. Only a single hairpin left in the dirt, the silver kind worn by unmarried girls. The shaman did not cry out. She only knelt in the ash and touched her forehead to the ground. Behind the hut, barely visible, were footprints, small, barefoot, and moving backwards into the jungle. No one followed. No one dared. "She has been taken," whispered the shaman. "Taken? By what?" Ko Min Thane's voice was hoarse, broken. The shaman rose, her voice flat as stone. "By the ones who never left." That night, the wind returned. It smelled like burnt cloth and river fog. Ko Min Thane stood at the edge of the village, staring into the trees. And then he saw her, standing just beyond the first line of bamboo trunks, motionless. Her veil was still on, but it hung crooked, heavy, soaked in soot. Her hands hung at her sides, her feet bare, blackened. She did not blink. She did not breathe. Her eyes were hollow, not sad, not angry, just empty. He took a step toward her, but with one slow movement, she stepped back and vanished into the trees. No one believed him the next morning. But they did believe the sound of coughing. They did believe the man who awoke that day with a throat full of black dust and lips too dry to speak. They did believe the child who tried to scream and could only wheeze. The elders ordered silence. No one was to speak of the bride. No name, no mention, not even in whispers. The spirits are watching, and they do not forgive those who interrupt their rituals. Ko Min Thane could not sleep. He burned the hairpin in the fire and buried its ashes at the foot of her family's home. But still the veil returned. Still the smoke clung to the trees. And in the silence of his dreams, he heard a voice, not hers, not the shaman's, just a whisper. You let them tie the door. Morning in Langson came not with birdsong, but with silence. Thick, cold, absolute. The mist hung low over the village, swallowing the stilted houses like an ocean of quiet. Smoke from the cooking fires didn't rise. It coiled around ankles, drifted sideways, refusing to lift. Even the dogs, who normally barked at the sight of strangers or shadows, lay curled beneath homes, tails twitching in restless sleep. Ko Min Thane stood alone before the smoke hut, its bamboo frame now cold and brittle, as though time had aged it overnight. The red silk that once bound the door still lay discarded on the ground. The ashes inside had cooled, turned gray and powdery, like the bones of something ancient. And those footprints, they were still there. Small, barefoot, leading away from the hut in unnatural fashion, heel first, not toe, backwards. No one touched them. No one dared. Children were told not to look. Elders muttered prayers under their breath. And the shaman Amayi sat cross-legged before the ceremonial grounds, eyes closed, lips unmoving, as if listening to something beneath the earth. Ko Min Thane broke the silence. She was taken, he whispered, though it hurt to say. She didn't walk away. She was led. The village chief, an old man whose hands never stopped shaking, looked at him with eyes red from sleeplessness. We do not speak of what does not return. If the bride was chosen by the smoke, then she belongs to the smoke. But she's not dead, he insisted. I saw her last night, standing in the trees, her veil. The elder raised a hand. Don't speak of her veil. Why not? Because it's hanging again. Ko Min Thane turned slowly. And there, at the edge of the forest, swaying slightly from the low branch of a thin tree, was the veil. Her veil. The one she had worn the night before. Soot-streaked, damp, still carrying the smell of herbs and smoke. Tied in a way no one in the village claimed to have done. It hadn't been there at dawn. That night, the coughing began. First a young girl, then her mother, then 3 men who had tended the ritual fire the day before. The coughing wasn't normal. It was dry, harsh, like lungs trying to expel something they couldn't reach, like dust being scraped from the inside of the body. They brought water, rice broth, bitter root tea. Nothing helped. The girl tried to speak, to say her mother's name, but her mouth filled with a gray residue. Her tongue went black at the edges, and still she was alive, just silent. The shaman gathered the elders by the moon platform, the center of all village ceremonies. She lit no fire, burned no incense, only sat with her hands folded and asked one question. Who spoke her name? No one answered. No one had. But Komin Thane felt a twist in his stomach. He had not said her name aloud, not exactly, but he had thought it. He had cried it in his heart as he ran toward the forest, as he saw her vanish. Was that enough? Was thinking her name an invitation? The next morning, the footprints had doubled. Still backwards, still bare, now leading from the edge of the trees toward the village. One path curved toward the home of the coughing girl. Another stopped outside the well. And the third, the longest, ended beneath Komin Thane's own window. He did not sleep that night, not even with a blade in his hand, because sleep is where the smoke comes. In his dream, she stood at the foot of his bed, Athandar, but not as he remembered. Her skin was the same, her face unchanged, but her eyes were filled with rising smoke, as if her soul were burning inside, leaking out through her gaze. She did not blink. She did not speak. She simply lifted her hands and untied her veil, letting it fall to the floor like a strip of burned cloth. He tried to reach for her, but the room filled with smoke, thick, heavy, sweet and rotting. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't move, and when he woke, his bedsheet smelled of ash, and his hands were black. By the third day, 7 villagers had lost their voices, each one with a layer of ash under their finger fingers, each one unable to say what they saw at night. One boy tried to draw it, using charcoal on wood. He showed a woman crouching in smoke, her face featureless, her hands bound with red cord. The shaman looked at the image and did not speak, but later that night she burned her own veil in a bowl of salt and blood, and at dawn she marked her hut with a single symbol in ash. The symbol for silence, but also for binding. Whispers began, not aloud, just passed through glances. Was it a curse? Was the ritual done wrong? Had the bride been too fearful, too proud? Or worse, had the spirits remembered something from long ago? One elder finally broke, his voice trembling like dry leaves in wind, and he told Komin Thane, This is not the first time. 50 years ago, long before Komin Thane was born, there had been another bride, a girl named Gwele, promised to the son of the headman, a dutiful, quiet girl. She too had entered the smoke room. She too had vanished by morning. But that time, the village cut down the hut, burned every piece of it, carried the ashes to the river. They abandoned the ritual for a generation, until the drought came, until the children died, until the river itself refused to flow. Then they brought the smoke room back and pretended the old bride had never existed. Komin Thane went to the river that day, alone. The wind had picked up. The forest was alive with the creak of bamboo and distant drumming, not from men, but from deep within the jungle, a sound that pulsed in his chest like a second heartbeat. At the river's edge, he found a flat stone, old and cracked, and beneath the moss, he found a carving, a name. Not Athandar, Gwele. Next to it, a single symbol, the same psh, burned on the shaman's hut. He ran back to the village, breathless, shaking. "She's not the first," he shouted. "They took her too! Gwele, the same way, the same ritual, and you never told us." The elders turned their backs. The chief shook his head. "We do not speak of the unreturned. But it's happening again! Then it is our fault, the chief whispered. We awakened the old way. We opened the door. That night no one lit fires. Doors were sealed with oil-soaked rope. Infants were made to sleep beside bowls of salt. Komin Thane sat in the center of his home, knife in one hand, the name Wei Lei carved into a piece of wood beside him, a reminder that this had happened before, that it was not a dream, not grief. Something had come back, and it wanted more. Because the footprints came again. This time they did not stop outside his window. They led into his home and ended beside his bed. And in the ashes left behind was a handprint, small, delicate, burned into the floor.
The morning air carried no warmth. The sun rose behind a veil of ash-colored fog, casting no shadows, only dull light that seemed unsure of itself. In Halang San, no one spoke anymore, not by tradition, by necessity. Those who tried found their throats rasped dry, their mouths full of soot. Words turned to dust. By now, 10 had lost their voices. The elders blamed the forest, the shaman blamed memory, Komin Thane blamed himself, and the veil returned. It was tied to the same crooked tree at the edge of the forest, swaying gently, even though the air was still. This time it was longer than he remembered, dragging through the grass like something pulled from the riverbed. Its edges frayed, its center marked with dark finger streaks. He had burned it once, yet here it was again. He approached it slowly, feet crunching over dry leaves. The villagers watched from afar, eyes wide, but no one moved to stop him. Not anymore. They feared her more than him now. The veil was cold to the touch, damp. He held it up, and it unfurled like a serpent's tongue, and something fell from inside. A single dried flower, blackened, curled like it had bloomed in fire. He remembered that flower. It was one he had picked the day he proposed, a Tayong Zalat, grown only in the rainy season, rare, fragile. She had dried it, tucked it into her veil for luck, but now it was burned, and it was here. She's not at rest, he whispered. She's wandering. That night, Komin Thane kept the veil in his home, not out of sentiment, but as proof. He set it on the floor beside his bed and lit no fire. He sat with the flower in one hand, knife in the other, back to the wall. He waited, and the trees responded. A sound, light at first, like feet brushing through fallen leaves, then closer, heavier. The bamboo outside creaked, and then silence, until something scratched the door, just once, then twice, then nothing. He didn't move, he didn't breathe, the veil remained still. But when dawn broke, he found a handprint of ash on the inside of the door. Elsewhere in the village, the silence deepened. One man, a hunter named U Song, tried to leave. He packed quietly, refused to speak, and at sunrise took the path westward out of the village. He was found an hour later at the foot of the banyan tree, eyes wide open, mouth caked in ash, lungs filled with smoke. No wounds, no blood, just emptied. A blackened smear of soot at his back, shaped like a hand. His bow still slung over his shoulder. The elders took it as a sign. There would be no leaving, not while the veil still hung in the trees. Komin Thane sought the shaman again. He found her kneeling by the old spirit well, her lips moving in a soundless chant, her face streaked with fresh soot, her hair unbound. "I saw her," he said softly. "She showed you the veil. She left it again." The shaman's eyes didn't open. "She's marking her path, marking those who must remember." "She doesn't want to be remembered," he said bitterly. "She wants to be returned." Now the shaman looked up. Her eyes were bloodshot, hollow. "You're wrong," she said. "She doesn't want to come back. She wants you to follow." He went to her house that evening. Athandar's home stood empty. Her mother stopped speaking the morning after the ritual. Her father disappeared into the jungle weeks earlier, days before the wedding, and never returned. The house still held her things, the wedding dress hanging behind a curtain, a pair of carved combs, her ink-stained prayer book. But one thing was missing: the bowl of ashes from the pre-wedding cleansing. Every bride burned a lock of her hair in it before entering the smoke room. He had seen it before. Now it was gone. In its place was a small mirror, cracked at the center. He looked into it, and for a brief second he did not see himself. He saw a version of her, sitting inside the smoke room, cross-legged, eyes open, body stiff like a puppet, veil draped, but something under it moved, like breath in the wrong direction. Then the mirror cracked further, and the image was gone. That night, the veil returned a third time, not hanging from a tree, but folded neatly on his bed, its edges soaked in water, its threads smelling like river mud and fire. And inside it, wrapped like a gift, was the name scroll from the wedding altar, burned at the ends, the ink nearly unreadable. Her name had been scrolled in red ink: Athandar, daughter of Thauma and Misan, bride of Komin Thane. But the name Athandar had been crossed out. Below it, carved in ash, no name, only bride. The village gathered in silence the next morning. The chief called for a meeting on the Hill of Ancestors, where old stones bore the names of the dead. It was where names were spoken during funerals. It was where blessings were given for births. But this time, no name was spoken, not hers, not anyone's. Instead, they buried the veil, wrapped it in clay, tied it with bark string, lowered it into a hollow at the base of the hill, and sealed it with earth and rice. They hoped that would be enough. They prayed in silence that it would end. But that night, the coughing returned, and this time, so did she. Komin Thane saw her again, at the tree line, closer now, not watching from afar, but stepping forward, 1 foot at a time. No veil, just black hair tangled with soot, skin covered in ash, her eyes no longer hollow, now filled with rage and something older than words. She raised her arm and pointed, not at him, but at the hill, the burial site. Then she turned and walked backwards, melting into the dark. He ran to the spot at dawn. The burial had been disturbed, the earth clawed open. The veil was gone. The shaman called it what the elders feared to say: spirit reversal, an ancient belief, a soul taken during a ritual gone wrong. The body no longer belongs to the living, but it never does belong to the dead. It becomes something else, a mouthpiece, a vessel for those who were never blessed. The smoke is no longer sacred, she said. It is corrupted. And the bride, Komin Thane asked. The shaman looked toward the forest. She was offered, and now she offers in return. That night, the trees did not sleep. The wind moaned through the branches like a chant in a language no one knew. Smoke rolled down the hill like fog, not from fires, but from the air itself. Children woke crying, mothers gagged on ash, and beneath every pillow a piece of the veil was found, charred, damp, marked with fingerprints, not theirs, not human, just bride-shaped silence pressing itself into their homes, their lungs, their dreams. The veil was no longer an object. It was a warning, and it was everywhere.
By the fourth day, words had vanished from Hlyangson. Not by decree, not by fear, but by force. Those who had once spoken freely now moved their lips in vain, soundless, scraping. Their eyes pleaded, but their voices were gone, as if the air itself refused to carry them. The children were the first to fall silent, then the midwives, then the elder who had built the smoke room with his own hands. The only one who still spoke freely was Min Thane, and that terrified him more than anything. The shaman sat before a circle of the mute. In her lap rested a bowl of river water turned gray. Each villager came forward and dipped a finger in the water, pressing it to their lips. The silence deepened. Each one left behind a smudge of ash on the surface. Then came the boy, the one who had drawn the image of the faceless woman. He no longer smiled. He carried a piece of wood on which he had carved a new figure. It showed a mouth open in a scream, with smoke pouring out like a ribbon, and around the mouth, drawn in dark charcoal, were tiny black hands pulling the tongue inward. The elders could no longer deny it. Something had claimed their voices. Something wanted silence. Min Thane walked through the village that night like a ghost among ghosts. No one looked at him. No one lit fires. No one dared move after dark. The only thing alive was the smoke, drifting in coils through empty windows, rising from earth where no fire burned. And in the wind, he began to hear it. Whispers. Not in Burmese, not in any language he knew, but intentional, wet, rustling, like voices pushed through rotting leaves. He followed it, through the fog, into the trees, until he found the old ceremonial clearing where the forest bent into a natural circle. There he saw it. Not her, not the bride, but a veil stretched between two trees like a web, torn and soaked in black fluid, with strips of what looked like tongue woven into its threads. Each strip had been flattened, dried and stitched with red thread. Each one still moved faintly twitching, as if remembering speech. He staggered backward and fell. The wind howled once, and then he heard it. A voice. Not from behind, not from within, but beneath the soil. You were supposed to call me back. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't any voice he had heard before. It was hundreds, layered, like all the words never spoken by the village collected in a single echo. He fled. The shaman waited for him in his home. No invitation, just silence. She sat by the hearth, holding the old bone pipe used in mourning rituals. When he entered, she looked up with tears in her eyes. Not from fear, but from guilt. You were supposed to say her name, she whispered. He stopped in the doorway. You told me not to. We all did. We thought silence would protect us. But it's feeding her. he said. The shaman nodded. "It is no longer her, but it wears her skin." She told him the truth then, the history kept buried in stone and shame. The Kyar Sen ritual had never been about blessings. It was a marriage between the living and the dead, an ancient pact to keep the spirits of war and famine at bay. One bride every third generation offered to the breathless ones, those who died without names, without graves, without rites. Their hunger was not for flesh, it was for memory and for voice. When Athundar entered the hut, she had not been alone. The smoke was not smoke, it was the waiting dead. And now, through her, they had found a way to return, not with screams, but with silence. The villagers began to lose more than voice. They lost expression. Their eyes dulled. Their hands no longer gestured. They did not cry. They simply watched. Even when a newborn choked on smoke and turned blue, the mother only rocked in silence, eyes fixed on the wall. It was as if grief had also been stolen, as if the bride was taking everything that made them human, one breath at a time. Komin Thane couldn't sleep. The dreams had turned into realities. He no longer knew when he was awake. He heard her voice even with his ears covered. He saw her fingers curl around his doorframe when no one else could. She was closer now. He felt her in the walls, in his lungs, and when he exhaled near a mirror, the condensation shaped itself into a veil. He went back to the smoke hut. It was falling apart, but still it stood. The ash inside had hardened. The jars were cracked. Yet in the center of the floor, where she had once sat, he found something new. A tongue, shriveled, gray, pierced with a silver hairpin. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees, and then the smoke rose again, not from jars, but from the ground. It filled the hut with choking thickness, and through it he saw her again, Athundar, or what remained. Her form crouched, face hidden behind a blackened veil, her hand stained with dirt and bone ash. She whispered one word, "Name." And when he tried to say it, he choked. He couldn't remember. He couldn't speak, not because he had forgotten, but because his voice was no longer his. He awoke outside the hut, throat bleeding, tongue blistered, eyes burned red. The shaman found him, held his head, and for the first time said the truth aloud. "The dead do not bless the bride. They take her, and through her they take us." In the days that followed, the village became a painting, still, soundless, fading at the edges. The children stopped blinking, the men stopped working, the women stopped dreaming. No one spoke, no one even tried, except for Komin Thane and the thing inside the bride. They spoke through dust now, through mirrors, through the movement of smoke under door frames, through the tongues that were no longer in mouths, but in shadows. And every time someone thought of her name, they forgot their own. The sky above Hluang Son no longer changed. It stayed a dull, pale gray, not cloudy, not clear, as though time itself had stopped breathing. The air was stagnant. The trees, once alive with bird calls,
now stood in reverent silence, like mourners at a wake no one dared speak of. The village had forgotten how to speak. But worse, they had begun to forget how to remember. Komintane saw it first in the children. A boy staring at his mother, confused. A girl turning circles in the dirt, whispering nonsense to no one. Then the adults, pausing mid-step, unsure where they were going, looking at their homes as though they didn't belong in them. Some forgot to eat, some forgot to sleep, some forgot their own names. And then came the most terrifying thing of all. No one remembered hers. Not the elders, not the midwives, not even Komintane. He sat at the altar they had built for the wedding. It was still intact, though now covered in a film of dust and spider webs. Offerings of dried fruit and folded leaves had turned brittle, untouched since the night she entered the smoke room. He stared at the name scroll. The ink had faded. The rice paper had curled at the edges. The place where her name had once been written now held only a blackened smear. He tried to say it aloud, but his tongue stopped at the first syllable. Not because it hurt, not because of fear, but because he simply couldn't find it. Her name was gone. Like smoke, like breath, like a song he once knew and could hum but no longer sing. He went to her home. Inside, the scent of burned herbs still lingered. Everything remained untouched, the dress, the combs, the cracked mirror. But when he searched for her old belongings, he found nothing bearing a name. No school papers, not a prayer cloth, not even her birth charm, a small silver ring engraved with the first letter of her name, worn by every child in the village until marriage. Gone, stripped, erased. And in the center of her floor, he saw it, a circle of soot, ringed with fingerprints, as though someone had knelt there again and again, trying to draw memory from ash. He ran to the shaman. She was sitting before a fireless bowl, whispering over an open scroll. She looked older now, not in years, but in weight, like her skin had grown too tired to carry her bones. "You told me not to say her name," he said, voice cracked. She nodded. "Because once the dead know it, they wear it," she whispered. "But no one remembers it now." "Yes." "You don't either?" She looked up at him and began to cry. "I delivered her," she said, trembling. "I named her. I gave her soul to the wind, her feet to the earth, her voice to the flame. I whispered her name into the river. And now, it's gone from me." Komintane refused to accept it. He stormed through the village, house to house, demanding records, relics, anything. But no one knew who he was talking about. When he said, "the bride," they blinked. When he said, "my wife," they looked away. When he said, "the smoke room," they shivered but said nothing. And when he held up the burned hairpin, once hers, and asked whose it was, they said, "No one wears those anymore." Even her mother didn't recognize it. Even her mother didn't recognize him. That night he dreamed of her again, but this time she did not stand at the edge of the trees. She was inside the smoke hut, her face hidden beneath a veil that bled soot like ink in water. She sat in silence, hands resting in her lap, back straight, unmoving. And around her, the names of the villagers floated in the air,
glowing, drifting, whispering. Names like Misan, Uthaw, I Nandar, Lin Het. And then his, Komintain, the last one. And as he watched, her head lifted, veil falling back, her mouth opened, and she swallowed his name whole. He woke gasping, clutching his chest. But worse than the breathlessness was the realization. When he went to the well that morning and greeted an elder, the man squinted. "Who are you?" "Komintain," he replied. But the words felt fragile, like a lie, like something borrowed. The elder frowned. "No, that boy left the village long ago." Panic set in. He returned to the altar, to her scroll, to the name. He needed to remember. He needed something. He dug through the base of the shrine, tearing up offerings, stones, incense bowls. And there, under a slab of clay, he found a hidden compartment. Inside, a thin, brittle book of lineage, handwritten. He flipped through page after page, families, births, marriages, his family, her family. And then, a blank. Where her name should have been, there was only a blackened line drawn across the page, like it had been scratched out by a burnt fingernail. And beneath it, one sentence written in red. "The name has been claimed." He took the book to the shaman. She did not speak. She only opened a scroll of her own, the village's oldest one, passed down from the first settlers. There, amidst faded ink and curling edges, was a passage he'd never seen. When the name is taken by the breathless, it becomes their mouth, it becomes their shadow, it becomes their hunger. The living will forget, the dead will not, and the bride will no longer bear her name, but many. It was no longer about remembering her name. It was about surviving without it. Because now, the thing in the veil was wearing them all. That night the veil returned once more, hung from the lintel of his door, but this time it was stitched with dozens of names, hand-sewn in ash. His name, the shaman's, the children's, each thread a voice, each stitch a soul, each name already half swallowed. He burned it, watched the threads twist and scream as they turned to smoke, but the air did not clear. It only laughed, softly, from beneath the floorboards. "You will forget too." And by morning, he did.
The shaman's house no longer smelled of herbs and old cloth. It smelled of smoke. Not the sacred kind, not the sweet curl of sandalwood or dried beetle, but thick, black smoke. The kind that clung to walls long after fire and whispered of something that had burned its way in and refused to leave. Ko Min Thang stood in her doorway, his name half forgotten on his tongue. He no longer trusted mirrors. He no longer trusted time. He only knew he had to ask her before he forgot the question. The shaman sat in the center of her floor, legs folded beneath her, bones visible beneath loose robes. Her hair was unbound, gray as winter ash, her lips smeared with soot in ceremonial lines. Before her, a bowl of black water. Not ink, not dye, but water from the spirit well, drawn at midnight and sealed from light, used only once in a generation, when the living forgot the names of the dead, and the dead started remembering. She looked up, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. Then slowly,
She reached out and touched his wrist. "You are the last who still knows," she whispered. "Knows what?" "Her grief." Komin Thang sank to his knees beside her. "I don't remember her name," he said. The shaman nodded. "That's not what matters now." "Then what does?" "That you remember her as bride, not body, because the thing wearing her face is not her." He clenched his fists. "She was taken." "Yes." "Can we bring her back?" "No," the shaman said, her voice thin as smoke. "But we can stop the others from following." She reached behind her and unwrapped a bundle wrapped in red-dyed cotton. Inside was a relic no one had seen in decades. A spirit bell, small, bronze, with a cracked wooden handle and 3 feathers tied to its frame. It was a burial tool, used not to summon, but to warn, not to call spirits forward, but to send them back. "No one uses those anymore," he said, "because no one believed we would need them again." She handed it to him. Her fingers trembled. "When the smoke bride comes, she comes as memory, but memory is a lie now. You must walk the forgetting." "What does that mean?" "You must go to the root, to the cave of the first vow." He felt the air shift around him. The cave, the place where the village had first sworn its marriage pact with the dead, long before shrines, before rice fields, before names. It was said no one returned from it, because those who entered had to give something to take anything back. "Bring the veil," the shaman said. "It's gone." She smiled faintly. "No, it always comes back. It wants to be seen." That night he sat alone in his home. He didn't speak, didn't write, didn't sleep. He waited. And just before midnight, it appeared. The veil, folded neatly on the floor. But this time, it was no longer black. It was white again, fresh, clean, as if it had never entered the smoke room. He touched it, and the room filled with whispering, voices of those who had forgotten themselves, children, elders, lovers, ancestors, all chanting one thing: "Give her back." He wrapped the veil, took the bell, and walked into the forest. The path to the cave of the first vow was not marked by stones or signs. It was marked by absence. Birds refused to nest in the trees above it. Roots twisted away from the soil that led there. Even the fog refused to cross its entrance. The mouth of the cave looked like an open throat carved from rock, jagged and gaping, as if the mountain itself had once screamed and then froze in silence. He stepped inside. The air was wet and cold. The walls pulsed with something unseen, and the deeper he went, the less he heard the world outside, until his own heartbeat felt like it belonged to something else. In the deepest part of the cave, he found the altar. Not man-made, but grown from stone, a natural slab marked with old burned symbols. Above it, blackened veils hung from the ceiling like skin, some torn, some still dripping ash, some twitching. He placed her veil in the center of the stone, and then he rang the bell. Once. The sound didn't echo. It was swallowed. Then the ground beneath the altar shifted, and a voice, not spoken, but pressed into his skull, said, "Give us the name." "I don't have it," he replied. "Then give us yours." His hands began to shake. "No, you wore her ring. You tied the cord. You watched her walk into smoke. She was offered, and you looked away." "I didn't know." You knew enough to remain silent." The veil on the altar began to move, rising as if filled with invisible breath. From the shadows, a figure emerged. The bride, but not as he remembered. Her dress was wrong, sewn from the names of the villagers, written over and over in black ink, now smudged and dripping. Her eyes were hollow, her feet backward, and in her mouth he saw tongues, curled like worms, twitching with soundless vowels. She opened her arms and whispered, "Come home." He rang the bell again, and her face cracked, like porcelain heated too quickly. Behind it, another face, then another, all mouths, all eyes, all brides forgotten, all taken. He dropped the bell and screamed, not in pain, but in remembrance, and the sound echoed. It bounced off the walls. It pushed the smoke back. It made the veils retreat, and in that moment, through his own voice, he remembered her name. "Ah, Thandar!" And the cave shuddered. The altar split, the veils burned, and the bride fell. He awoke outside the cave at dawn, blood in his throat, ash in his lungs, but the veil was gone, and in his hand the bell had turned to stone. He returned to the village. The fog had lifted. The children were speaking again. The shaman was gone, her hut empty, her body never found, but her voice lived in the wind. Some names return, some names stay lost, but some names remember us too. And from that day forward, the villagers spoke every name. No one was forgotten again, especially not hers. The fog returned the next morning. Not heavy, not choking, just present. It drifted low to the ground, curling around ankles, brushing along door frames like fingers remembering how to knock. It wasn't dangerous, not yet, but the people of Hlang Son had learned to fear presence without sound. Even the birds didn't return. Even the wind forgot to blow. And though Komin Thane had emerged from the cave of the first vow with her name, Tandar, carved into his breath like a wound, nothing truly felt over. The veil was gone. Yes. The cave was sealed. Yes. But the village was not healed. Because the question remained, what did the dead take in return? The elders called a gathering at the moon platform. For the first time in weeks, words were spoken aloud, softly, carefully, like fragile pottery held by tired hands. They told stories of other rituals, of past rains that never came, of children who spoke too soon and never spoke again. And in these stories, there was one truth. When the dead are disturbed, something must be given. A trade, a silence, a life. But this time, the bride had not just been taken, she had spoken back. And the name Tandar still clung to their roofs, to their doorposts, to their breath. The shaman had vanished. The smoke room was ashes. But the memory of the vow, the true vow, still lingered. Komin Thane stood before them and said, "We remembered her, and in doing so, we called something home. We must now offer something of our own, not in fear, in atonement." No one argued. They simply asked, "What?" That evening, the villagers gathered their most sacred items, offerings, not of gold, not of food, but of memory. One by one, each person laid something at the foot of the banyan tree, now blackened from the smoke. A grandmother placed the woven sash from her own wedding, still stained with turmeric. A boy left his carved slingshot, used to chase birds in brighter seasons. A midwife placed her mother's prayer beads, worn smooth by years of hope. And Komin Thane, he placed the final drawing Tandar had made before the ritual, a lotus floating alone on a pool of ink. No one spoke. They only burned incense, and then they waited. Mist gathered slowly, thickening around the offerings, winding upward like curious breath. A low hum, not quite wind, not quite voice, filled the grove. The fire went out, the incense stilled, and then the earth trembled. Just once, and in the silence that followed, the offerings began to sink, as though the roots of the banyan tree had opened their mouths and begun to swallow. The villagers stepped back. The boy cried softly. Komin Thane closed his eyes. Let this be enough. At midnight, the veil returned, but not at the banyan tree. It was found outside the schoolhouse, pinned to the wall with thorns. A message had been scratched into it, not written in ink, but in fingernail. 4 words. One bride was not enough. The mist thickened. It crept into the rice fields. It filled the wells. It curled under floors and into dreams. And in those dreams, the villagers began to see her again. Tandar, or what was left. Her veil soaked in sorrow. Her dress sewn from voices she had swallowed. Her face stitched with names. But this time, she stood with others, 6 figures behind her, all veiled, all brides, all lost, their arms open, their mouths full of dust. The elders gathered again at dawn. They read the message. They wept, and they made the choice that would define the rest of the story. They would choose another bride. Komin Thane stood. No! The chief lowered his eyes. The pact must be honored. It was a lie, all of it. It was protection. It was murder. Silence followed, until an old woman, the widow of a man who had choked on ash, whispered, "Then you go in his place." That night, Komin Thane packed a satchel. Inside he placed the broken bell from the cave, the burnt wedding scroll, a candle wrapped in red thread, and the name, her name, Tandar, written in his blood. He walked back to the place where the smoke room once stood. Nothing remained but ash and stone and silence. He built a small fire, sat cross-legged, lit the candle, and whispered her name. Once, softly, lovingly. The mist responded immediately. It gathered around him, coiling, breathing. A veil drifted down from the trees, not hung, not dropped, placed like a crown. And then he saw her, Tandar, sitting across from him, not veiled, not monstrous, just tired. her face streaked with soot, her lips cracked, her eyes remembering. He whispered again, "You can come home now." She said nothing, but she raised her hand, and behind her, the 6 veiled brides turned away and vanished. When he awoke, the candle was gone, but the veil was folded beside him, clean, white, untouched. He carried it to the banyan tree and placed it in the crook of its roots. He did not bury it. He did not burn it. He left it for the mist to decide. And that night, the fog lifted. For the first time in weeks, the stars returned. The veil remained untouched beneath the banyan tree. 3 days passed. The mist receded. Birds returned to the trees cautiously. Children began to laugh again, not loudly, but with the kind of laughter that seemed to ask for permission. And the villagers, though hesitant, began to breathe like people again. But Ko Men Fain did not fully. He still woke in the dark hours before dawn, heart racing, eyes fixed on corners of the room where the shadows refused to soften. He still heard her name in the rustling of leaves, still smelled the smoke when no fire burned, and worse than anything, he still saw her. At first, it was only in dreams. Thandar, sitting beneath the tree where the veil now rested. Her face was turned away, her hands folded in her lap, the wind lifting her hair like breath. He would call her name. She wouldn't answer. And then, just as he reached her, she would vanish into smoke. But one night the dream changed. She turned, and this time she spoke. "You burned the veil," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, I gave it back. Not to me." She raised her hands. They were empty. And then she opened her mouth, and what came out was not voice, but a shadow, curling, pulsing, dragging itself across the ground like a wound made of breath. He woke with ashes on his tongue. The next night, she came again, closer. This time she was not alone. Behind her stood a second bride, veiled, silent. No face, no feet, just a figure made of dark fabric and dripping hair. They stood together, staring. Ko Men Fain asked, "Who is she?" Thandar turned her eyes toward him and said, "The next one." He returned to the banyan tree the next morning. The veil was still there, but now a second veil had been folded beside it, smaller, frayed at the edge, child-sized. He fell to his knees, because he knew the curse was not broken, only paused, and something else had been promised in return. He took both veils to the temple ruins, the oldest place in the village, abandoned long ago, now overgrown and split with vines. There he found the shaman's journal, tucked beneath a stone idol whose face had long since crumbled. Pages yellowed, ink faded, but still legible. She had written one final entry before she disappeared. "The ritual is not a door, but a mirror. What we give to the smoke, we see again, but not as we remember. The dead are not cruel, only hungry, and they no longer want silence. They want us to join the vow." The vow, the ancient pact. It had never been about offering a bride for blessing. It had been about creating a bridge between living and dead, a marriage of soul to shadow. And once the bridge was opened, even once,
the dead would continue to walk it, unless someone closed it from the other side. That night, Ko Min Thane stood before the banyan tree with both veils in hand. He lit no fire. He spoke no prayer. He simply said, "I'll go." The wind did not stir. The trees did not bend. But the air changed. It thickened. And from the mist, she came, Athandar. Not broken, not monstrous, just still. Her eyes deep, bottomless. Her hair braided the way she wore it on their engagement day. She walked until she stood before him and gently took one veil, the smaller one. "This is not for you." "I thought it was." "It's for someone not yet named." He trembled. "Then what do I do?" She looked up, and for the first time there was something behind her eyes that was not death, grief. "Come with me," she said, "just once, and come back remembering." He followed her, into the mist, into the woods, past the stone where her name had once been scratched, past the smoke hut's ashes, into a place no path had ever marked. And there, beneath the roots of a fallen tree, was a small opening, a gap in the earth, a narrow slit that breathed cold. She knelt before it and whispered her name into the soil. The ground opened, and they stepped inside. It was not a cave, not exactly. It was a room formed of woven smoke and bone. Hundreds of veils hung from the ceiling, each one marked with a name, some familiar, some ancient, some not yet spoken. In the center, a pool, black, still, reflective. Athandar stepped to its edge. "This is where they come through." He stared into it. It did not show his reflection. It showed the village, years from now, the smoke room rebuilt, another bride kneeling in silence, a child crying in the distance. The veil burned again, and again, and again. "How do we stop it?" he asked. She looked at him. "Give the mirror back." He didn't understand, but when she reached into the pool and pulled out a shard of glass, cracked and blackened, he remembered it. Her mirror, in her house, the one that cracked the day she disappeared, the one that showed her changing before he could stop it. She handed it to him. It burned his fingers. "Take it to the altar," she whispered, "where the vow began, and speak my name, but do not look inside it again." He awoke in his bed, the mirror in his lap, a single thread of red tied around its handle, and outside, the mist had begun to gather again.
No one heard the mist return. It didn't crawl this time. It poured, a slow, heavy flood that blanketed Lang Son by dawn. Windows clouded from within. Rice fields disappeared beneath a shroud of white. And when the sun rose, it did not cast light, only a dim, colorless glow that seemed to exist without warmth. Ko Min Thane stood in the village square, clutching the cracked mirror given to him by Athandar beneath the veil root tree. The shard was heavier than it should have been. It hummed with something unspoken, and he could feel the memory of her hands still lingering in the frame, warm, trembling. He had one task: take it to the altar where the vow began, place it in silence, speak her name, but do not look inside. The problem was, the altar no longer existed. It had been burned decades ago. a forgotten circle of stone in the heart of the jungle, erased by vines and fear and the lie of tradition. The village had built new ceremonies, new platforms, new stories. But the altar, the true altar, had been where the first bride was taken. And now the first bride was calling again. Not in words, but in silence. Komenthane tried to rally the elders, tried to speak, tried to explain. But one by one they turned their heads. Their lips moved, but no sound emerged. They had gone quiet again, not from smoke, not from fear, but from surrender. It was as if the mist had taken the language first so that thought would be easier to consume. Children no longer asked questions, mothers no longer sang, fathers no longer warned. Only Komenthane still held his voice, and even that, he could feel it fraying. He set out alone that afternoon, carrying the mirror wrapped in cloth, wearing the red thread bracelet Thundar had tied on his wrist before the wedding. Its color had faded, but the knot remained. He walked through the rice fields, through the forest path, and into the part of the jungle where no stories were told anymore, where trees grow too close together, where birds never landed, where breath felt borrowed and memory trembled. He found the altar at dusk, half swallowed by roots, broken in places, but still there. A low circle of stone ringed by smaller cairns, each marked with a symbol long forgotten, a language that existed only in breath and ash. He knelt in the center, unwrapped the mirror, and placed it on the stone. It shivered, then stilled. The air grew tight, then silent, not just in sound, in presence, like the world was holding its breath. He reached for the knot on his wrist, held it, and whispered, Thundar. Nothing happened, at first. Then the mist moved. It didn't swirl, it didn't rise, it parted. And in the clearing beyond the altar, 7 figures appeared, veiled, still. Their feet hovered inches above the soil, their hands folded, their veils made of smoke, and in front of them, Thundar, unveiled, eyes open, not hollow, but pained. She stepped forward and opened her mouth, but no sound came. Only a slow exhale of ash, and with it, a name, Ngwele, the first bride. He recognized it, the one who vanished a generation ago, the one they never spoke of, the one they buried in silence and built a new ritual over. Behind Thundar, one of the veiled brides stepped forward and dropped her veil. She was young, no more than 16, skin pale, eyes blank, mouth stitched shut with red thread. Thundar turned to Komenthane and said, "They want her back." He shook his head. "She's already gone." "Then someone must replace her." "No, they are owed." The mist grew thick again. The other brides began to drift closer, their faces still hidden, but their feet brushing the ground now, no longer floating, crossing. Komenthane gripped the edge of the altar. "Take me." Thundar stared at him. "You are not enough. I was her groom, but you looked away." And then the mirror cracked again, without being touched, a spiderweb fracture blooming across the surface, and in it, just for a moment, Komenthane saw a reflection that wasn't his, a child, a young girl, wearing the smaller veil, mouthing something silently. The image vanished, He covered the mirror with the cloth again, heart racing. Authundar stepped forward. "If you look again, you will forget yourself." "I already have." "Then give me your name." He paused. He reached into his pocket, took out the burnt wedding scroll, and with a piece of charcoal, he crossed his name out. Not from hate, from offering. And he handed it to her. Authundar took it in shaking hands, held it to her chest, and wept, not with tears, but with smoke. Her veil returned to her shoulders, and one by one the other brides turned to face the forest and vanished. Only Authundar remained. She looked at the altar, at the mirror, at Comin Thane, and whispered, "It is not over, but it is paused." He nodded and asked, "Will you return?" She didn't answer, but her veil fell to the stone, folded itself, and turned to dust. When Comin Thane returned to the village, the silence had lifted. Voices stirred again, low, shaky, but alive. Children remembered their names. Mothers remembered their songs. And at the center of the square was the banyan tree, its leaves still, but its roots no longer bloomed veils, only red blossoms. 7. No more, no less. The red blossoms at the base of the banyan tree did not fall. They remained intact, untouched by wind or weather, as if time itself dared not pass too close. The villagers spoke again. They laughed, they sang softly. They rebuilt their shrines, replanted rice, painted new names over forgotten graves. But beneath their relief lived something else, a rhythm, a pattern. Because though they had survived the storm, the smoke had not left. It had only settled, waiting. Comin Thane kept to himself after that. He no longer dreamed. He no longer heard her name in the wind. But he knew the veil had not been destroyed, only thinned, like skin healing over a wound still warm underneath. He visited the banyan tree each week, brought flowers, left offerings, said nothing. And each time the roots felt colder, as if something beneath were shifting again. A season passed, then another, and on the night of the third harvest moon, the air changed again. The mist came, thin, almost imperceptible, but scented like old incense, and the sky refused to darken. It stayed a dim shade of silver, as if trapped between night and memory. That evening, a child disappeared. A girl named Nandar, just 14. She had been helping her mother clean old ceremonial robes from the temple ruins. She stepped outside to fetch water and never came back. Only her sandals were found. One by the river, one at the edge of the clearing where the smoke room once stood. Comin Thane heard the drums at dawn, not ceremonial, alarm. He rushed to the square. A crowd had gathered. The child's mother wept in silence, rocking back and forth, holding the red sash her daughter had worn that morning. And behind the crowd, tied to a tree, was something no one dared touch. A veil, freshly woven, still wet with dew, marked with a single word burned into the edge: bride. He felt the blood leave his face. It had returned. The ritual, the hunger, the invitation. Only this time, the spirits had not waited for a ceremony. They had chosen, unasked, and taken. The elders met that night. Candles flickered in a ring, voices low, fractured. Some argued to rebuild the smoke room, to finish what was started, they said. To give her passage, they whispered. Others refused. No more brides, they said. No more offerings. But the veil remained, pinned to the tree with a bone pin not made by human hands. Ko Min Thane listened, and then stood. We do not rebuild, we retrieve her. The elders fell silent. One asked, How? And he answered, The veil is not a shroud, it is a map. That night, he took the veil, wrapped it in cloth soaked with salt water and ash. He followed where the fibers frayed, where the dew still clung, where the edge burned hotter than it should in moonlight. He walked into the forest, past the place where the altar had stood, beyond the root-split trees, deeper than the cave of the first vow, to a clearing where no wind stirred. And there the smoke rose again, thin tendrils breathing from the soil, coiling into the shape of a small seated figure. A girl, veiled, bound, silent. Nandar. The figure twitched, then lifted its head, but the veil did not fall. It tightened, and from the ground around her, 7 others rose, the veiled brides. Back again, their arms outstretched, their feet buried in the earth, their veil stitched with names not yet given. Ko Min Thane raised the child's veil and shouted, She is not yours! The earth split. Smoke burst upward. The child's body collapsed, and from her mouth spilled a scream made of soot. But then a wind rose, sharp, clean. It blew through the clearing, scattering ash, and in its wake stood a figure cloaked in red. Afandar. She raised her hand. The other brides froze. She looked at Ko Min Thane, and for the first time in a year, smiled. You remembered. Then she turned to the child, lifted the veil, and whispered something no one could hear. And the child, wide-eyed, trembling, opened her mouth and said, I'm not ready. Thandar nodded. Then go home. The girl ran, into the trees, through the mist, back to the village. Ko Min Thane fell to his knees. The red-cloaked bride stood before him, her veil gone, her eyes clear. She said, They will keep returning until someone stays. He looked up. I will. She shook her head. You've already gone too far. Then who? She turned her face to the others, and one by one they stepped forward, dropped their veils, revealed nothing, only shadows, and then faded into the air. All but one, the last, a bride with no face, No name, just a single word stitched across her chest. Silence. Thondar stepped beside her, and together they vanished. Back in the village, the child returned, unharmed, but older, changed. She didn't speak for days, but when she finally did, she whispered just 3 words. She let me. No one rebuilt the smoke room after that. The banyan tree bloomed white blossoms instead of red. The altar stone cracked in half, never healed. But each year, on the 3rd harvest moon, the mist returns. Light, lingering, watching. And somewhere beneath the trees, a bride still waits, not for a groom, but for a voice willing to speak her name again.
Komin Thane hadn't spoken in weeks, not because he couldn't, but because he no longer trusted words. He had seen what happened when a name was spoken too loudly. He had seen what rose when silence was offered like prayer. And he had seen what lingered between them, the weight of the unsaid. The village had returned to quiet, but not peace, not truly, because now they knew. The vow had not been broken, it had only been delayed. And if there was to be an end, someone would have to speak again, loudly, clearly, to the dead. Each morning, the villagers gathered at the banyan tree in silence, not out of fear, out of reverence. A girl had been returned. The veils had vanished, and Thandar, whatever she had become, had kept her promise. But something lingered. The mist no longer smothered the village, but it still traced the edges of the forest like a waiting breath. Children now whispered instead of laughed. Mothers now watched the moon before sleeping, and no one walked alone at dusk. Komin Thane felt it most. The pressure behind his ribs, the ache behind his eyes, like a word stuck in his throat that wasn't his, like a story not yet finished. One night, he stood before the ruins of the old shrine and said, for the first time in months, her name, Thandar. And the wind listened. It didn't howl, it didn't scream, it simply gathered, like a breath being drawn in, like a veil being lifted. That night, she came to him in a dream. But this time, she did not wear red. She did not bleed ash. She did not stand in mist. She stood in a house, their house, untouched, unchanged, as if the ritual had never happened. She sat at the table, hands folded, eyes soft. "You never said it," she whispered. "Said what?" "My name during the ritual." He blinked. "I wasn't allowed." "Who told you that?" "The elders, the shaman. They feared speaking the name would bring the dead closer. But not speaking it left me with them." He stepped forward. "I remember it now." "Then say it." He opened his mouth, and the dream ended. He woke, gasping. The mirror beside his bed had cracked again, spidering out from the center. The knot around his wrist, the one she had tied, had come undone.
The thread lay beside him like a shed skin. That morning, he left the village. No farewell, no ceremony, only the mirror, the knot, and her name folded on a piece of cloth. He walked to the river, then beyond, to the old monastery at the edge of the cliffs, a place spoken of only in whispers, a place where monks once kept the forbidden prayers, words too old for paper, too sharp for breath, too sacred for silence. He found the ruins overgrown, half swallowed by moss and time. But deep in the cellar, behind crumbling stone and dust-thick air, he found the voice scroll. It was wrapped in fabric so dark it seemed to drink the light. Inside, a single line, written in a language he did not know, but somehow understood. To return the bride, you must speak her name through the veil of the dead. And then, but if the dead answer, they do not return her, they keep you. He tucked the scroll and returned home. That night, he stood alone in the smoke room ruins, a circle of ash where walls had once stood. He unwrapped the mirror, laid the scroll beside it, and placed her name, written in his own blood, atop both. Then he waited. The mist arrived first, thin, gentle, listening. Then the silence came, a silence deeper than quiet, one that pushed against the chest, that slowed the pulse, that tasted of forgetting. And then the veil returned, unfolding itself from the air, floating downward, landing across the mirror like a kiss. He knelt, trembling, and whispered, "Ah, Thandar." The mirror responded, fogging, then clearing, showing her face, not twisted, not veiled, just hers. Tears in her eyes. "You said it again," she whispered. So he did. "Ah, Thandar." And the veil moved, lifted, floated to his face, draped gently across his mouth, and from behind it, he spoke her name a third time. The ground trembled, the scroll burned, the mirror shattered, and the air exploded with voices. All the names never spoken, all the names swallowed by smoke, all the names erased by fear. They poured from the trees, from the roots, from the stones, 1,000 forgotten woes breaking. And then, just as quickly, silence. She stood before him, alive, or close to it, hair loose, feet bare, eyes open, her veil in her hands. She stepped forward, placed the veil on his shoulders, and whispered, "You broke the silence. Now you must keep it." And she faded, back into the world, back into the wind. When Coman Thane returned to the village, he could no longer speak. Not from fear, not from loss, but from exchange. He had traded voice
for return, and she walked back through the forest the next day, alone, silent, breathing, alive.
She came back at sunrise. No ceremony, no thunder, just the crunch of dry leaves beneath bare feet and the slow ripple of mist parting for her return. Ah, Tandar, alive, but changed. The villagers gathered at a distance, unsure whether to embrace or fear. She walked through them like wind through branches, brushing, but not touching. Her eyes were the same, but something behind them had aged beyond years. She had seen something the rest of them hadn't, carried something the living shouldn't. And Ko Min Tain, he did not greet her, because he no longer spoke. He sat by the banyan tree, mouth closed, eyes open, the remnants of the veil still wrapped around his shoulders like a collar of fog. Ah Tandar came to him, knelt before him, and reached for his hands. He did not pull away. She pressed her forehead to his, and they stayed that way, bride and groom, wordless and bound by something deeper than language, a vow neither of them had chosen, but both had paid for. Later she spoke to the village. Her voice was quiet, dry, as though unused for years. "I remember the smoke," she said. "I remember the voices inside it. I remember the names that were taken, the ones we forgot, the ones we let fade." She looked toward the mountains and said, "They were not evil. They were not angry. They were left behind." The elders bowed their heads. The mothers held their children tighter. The midwives touched the ground with trembling hands, because they all knew this had never been about a ritual gone wrong. It had been about a lineage broken, a pact dishonored, an ancestry erased by silence. That evening, the villagers gathered scrolls, carvings, memory cloths. They brought out names that hadn't been spoken in decades. They built fires, not to cleanse, but to remember. And as each name was read aloud, ash fell like snow, gentle, forgiving, sacred. It coated their hands, their shoulders, their feet. And then, slowly, it dissolved, not into air, but into soil. Ah Tandar took the lead. She returned to the smoke room ruins, but instead of rebuilding it, she gathered its ashes in a clay bowl and mixed them with water from the old well. She formed the mixture into small, dark beads, one for each forgotten name. She strung them into necklaces, one for every villager, and said, "Wear them not as mourning, but as remembrance. They are no longer calling for us. They are among us." Ko Min Tain was the last to receive his. She placed it around his neck, then held his face and whispered, "You brought me back." He looked at her, unable to speak, but his eyes told her everything, and she nodded, then placed a finger to her lips and whispered again, "I will speak for you now." In the weeks that followed, Ah Tanda became the new shaman, not by title, not by power, by presence. She taught the children the forgotten lullabies. She blessed the rice with names, not chants. She kept firewood in the shape of ancestral symbols. And each full moon,
She walked into the trees and left a single bead at the root of the veil tree. Not out of fear, but out of thanks. One day, a stranger came to the village. Lost, wandering, a foreign merchant with no maps and too many questions. He spoke of strange weather downriver, of cities covered in fog, of women vanishing from their weddings without a trace. The villagers listened, and Ah Tandar handed him a single bead. She said, "Tell them to speak the names they've buried, or the silence will bury them instead." That night, Ko Min Tain dreamed of fire. Not destruction, but warmth. Inside the flame, he saw the mirror, whole again. In its surface, his face, and behind it, all the brides, watching, not waiting, just witnessing. And then, one by one, they turned away. When he woke, the knot on his wrist had turned black, then crumbled to ash, and in its place, a new thread had been tied. Red, bright, alive, knotted by hands that remembered love and forgave silence.
They called it a wedding, but no songs were sung, no rice was thrown, no drums were played beneath the trees. Instead, the villagers lit 7 lanterns, each marked with a forgotten name. They wove a path of firelight through the forest. They built no altar, no stage, only a circle, marked in soot, not flowers. And in its center stood Ah Thandar, draped in gray, veilless, silent, a bride who had walked through smoke and returned not with scars, but with memory. She turned slowly as the villagers gathered, her gaze sweeping the old faces, the young hands, the trembling elders. And when her eyes found Ko Min Tain, she smiled, not with joy, but with something deeper, release. This would not be a marriage of man and woman, not of body, not even of soul. It would be a marriage of witness and warning, of the living and what they'd learned from the dead. The shaman's seat remained empty. Ko Min Tain stood beside it, holding a mirror remade, not the one that had cracked, but a new one, forged with ash glass and veinstone from the river cave. Its surface was clouded with silver leaf, and when the light caught it, faces flickered in it, not clearly, but enough to remind. He placed it on the altar stone and spoke aloud for the first time in moons. "This is the last wedding, not of taking, not of silence, but of return." The wind stirred, the lanterns danced, and from the forest came the low sound of footsteps, but no one turned to run. They stood in the circle, shoulder to shoulder, holding ash beads in trembling fingers, because they had all made the same vow, to remember. The figures emerged like mist becoming form. 7, as always, brides from long ago, from stories told too late, from names left off scrolls. They stood at the edge of the circle, veiled, motionless. Then one stepped forward, dropped her veil, and spoke. "We accept." Ah Thandar stepped forward too. She did not kneel, she did not bow. She held up her hand and placed the final ash bead into the other bride's palm. It glowed briefly, then faded. One by one, the other brides did the same. Each took a bead, each dropped a veil, each released a memory, and with each, the mirror began to glow. Faint at first, then brighter, until its surface shimmered like moonlight over river stones, and inside, a reflection began to form. Not of the village, not of the forest, but of another place, a place of doorways made of breath, of bridges woven from names, of ancestors waiting not for vengeance, but for recognition. Thandar turned to Ko Min Thane. "They're ready." He nodded, though tears blurred his sight. "What do we give them?" She smiled. "We give them the truth." Together, they stepped into the mirror, not physically, not completely, but with voice and memory, and all the names they carried in silence for too long. And the mirror opened. Light poured from it slow and steady, and from within came sound, a chant not made from language, but from breath, the sound of names spoken by the mouths who once bore them, the sound of sorrow, letting go. And from the village circle the people wept, not in fear, in completion. One by one the veiled bride stepped into the mirror. As they passed, their veils turned to dust, and where they had stood, lotus flowers bloomed in the soil. 7 in all, each white, each perfect, each scentless, like the breath of something finally at peace. Thandar was the last one to step forward. She turned to Ko Min Thane, took his hands and placed her veil into them. "This time, no one binds the door. This time, I choose." He didn't speak, but he smiled and let her go. As she vanished into the mirror, the glass rippled, then calmed, then turned opaque, and shattered into mist. All that remained was the veil, folded, clean, still. Ko Min Thane picked it up, held it to his chest, and wept, not from grief, but from gratitude. They buried the veil beneath the banyan tree. No stone, no marker, only a whisper written in ash. "Here lies the last bride, returned." Years passed, then decades, and slowly the story of the bride in the smoke room faded into something softer than memory, something whispered only when the fog grew too thick or the river ran too still. No one rebuilt the hut. No one spoke the ritual's name. And yet, every third harvest moon, the mist still came. Not choking, not dark, just present, lingering at the edge of the forest, like someone standing in the doorway, not entering, not leaving, just watching. The village changed. New houses rose on old soil. New children played beneath the banyan tree. New names were etched onto the family stones behind the temple ruins. But something remained. Not fear, not curse, something more intimate. A stillness, as if the village itself remembered what the people tried to forget. Travelers rarely found Hwaeng Son. Even fewer returned. Those who did told strange stories of a place where no one used surnames, where no doors had locks, where every child wore a red thread on their wrist until the day they first spoke their name, and where, beneath the largest tree in the square, no one ever sat, because beneath it was buried a veil and a vow. They called it the village without names, because outsiders were never told who was who. The people lived without titles, without introductions. They spoke to each other with eyes, with gestures, with the kind of knowing that did not need words. And when asked why, they said only this: "A name is a door. If you leave it open too long, something may walk through." Some called it superstition, others folklore. But there were things no one could explain, like how the river never dried, how no crops ever failed, how no bride had gone missing in 100 years, or why, each year, at the same hour, a girl dressed in pale gray would walk through the square, barefoot, silent, and stop beneath the banyan tree. She would place a single white lotus at its roots, then vanish into the mist. No one followed her. No one asked her name, because they all knew some names are too sacred to speak. Ku Min Tain was never seen again after that final wedding. Some say he went with her. Others say he wandered into the forest and became part of it, a breath between trees, a shadow in stillness, a man with no name left to call his own. But sometimes, when the moon is full and the mist hangs low, the children say they see him, sitting at the edge of the banyan grove, carving beads from ash, smiling, waiting. And the mirror? Gone. Or perhaps never real. Perhaps it had always been metaphor, the reflection of guilt, of forgetting, of what we allow ourselves to bury too deeply. But in the old temple, what's left of it, there's a room no one enters. Inside, on the wall, a phrase written in faded soot: "Speak not the bride's name, lest she speak through you." And beneath it, carved so faint it nearly disappears: "But forget her, and she will return." The villagers no longer feared the smoke, but they did not tempt it. No one burned herbs on wedding nights. No one sealed doors with red cord. No one wove veils by hand. Instead, they placed small bowls of water on their windowsills. They scattered ash in the corners of their homes, and they spoke the names of their ancestors aloud, not in prayer, but in conversation. "Grandmother, guide me. Father, forgive me. Sister, stay with me." Because now they understood. The dead do not ask for silence. They ask to be remembered. One year, a scholar came from the city. He wore glasses and a hat too large for his head. He asked many questions, took many notes. When he reached the banyan tree and saw no marker, he dug carefully in the soil. He found only ash, and at the very bottom, a strand of red thread, still knotted, still warm. He asked the villagers what it meant. They only smiled and said, "You've met her then." He left that night and never spoke of the village again. But in his journal, one page was marked differently. Pressed flat between two pages, a single white lotus. Next to it, "Some stories are not meant to be written, only remembered." And so it is. The village endures. The veil sleeps beneath the tree. The river runs clear. And when the mist comes, they do not hide. They simply wait, in stillness, in knowing, in remembrance. Because long ago, a bride entered the smoke and did not return. And then she did.